Jy is ingeskakel op GROOTplaas en vanoggend gesels ons 'n bietjie met Derek Donkin en hy's van Fruit South African Avocado Growers Association om te gesels oor die avokado bedryf in Suid-Afrika. Derek, good morning and thank you for your time.
Morning, Duppy.
So let's start off. Why is avocado so expensive in South Africa?
I think it's about supply and demand, and obviously people are wanting a fruit that they know is healthy to eat and is great tasting as well, and you can eat it any time of the day and with any meal. So all the things that you need to spur on demand.
So the other question obviously would be then, how many cultivars are we growing in South Africa at the moment?
We're growing about 4 or 5 major ones, and then there are some newer ones that are going to come in, and they're still at an experimental stage. But at the moment, we've got 2 big groups. It's what we call the green skin cultivars. So the common ones are Fuerte, Ryan, Pinkerton. And then we've got Hass and the Hass types one, which is the black skinned or the dark skinned one, which is dark when it ripens. So that's Hass. But then you've also got newer ones like Maluma Hass, Lamb Hass, and then the ones like Gem and Mendez as well. So the number of cultivars is growing slowly.
So I was looking at some of the statistics, and last year South Africa produced around 155,000 tons of avocados. What's driving this growth? Because that's year-on-year growth.
Yeah, so, well, it's not year on year. That's our annual production of avocados in South Africa, 155,000 tons more or less. And there's a growing demand, and obviously when there's a growing demand, the money that's made from growing avocados is good. So growers will plant more because there's an opportunity there. So that's generally what's driving the growth locally and globally. There's an increasing demand for avocados.
So you mentioned globally now. How is South Africa positioned in the international market when it comes to the exports of these fruit?
We are not the major supplier in the world market. If one looks at the export market and the major importing areas in the world, the USA will be number 1, and their major supplier is Mexico, and then some of the other South American countries. And we supply Europe and the UK, and we're sitting at probably about number 2 or 3. But we also tie alongside countries like Israel, Spain, Chile and Colombia into that market. So we're not the biggest, but we're one of the major role players in Europe and the UK.
So maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit with the exports, especially to the UK and Europe. What makes South African avocados competitive in these markets?
Okay, a very difficult question to answer because there's nothing really unique about South African avocados, but what makes us competitive is the ability to supply good quality reliably. A lot of the fruit is sold in retail programs in big supermarkets, and to supply a big supermarket, you've got to have reliable supply and it's got to be good quality. So that's what we focus on in this country. We're not focusing on being the biggest. Peru is definitely the biggest supplier into that market, and we compete directly with them. So it's not easy. It's difficult at this stage, especially if you clash with the major Peruvian season. So I talked earlier about the money being good, but if you're in the mid-season at the moment, it is very difficult. What South African growers are doing as well is looking for opportunities to grow in areas where you can supply either early or late, so outside of the peak Peruvian season, because that's still where there's money to be made.
So am I correct in saying that there is a bit of overlap with our harvesting season and the overseas seasons?
Correct. So, yeah, we're not the only supplier into that market. So we, at the moment, if you look at any given week in the peak season, which we are sort of in now, coming to the end of, we probably only supply 15 or 20% of the volume that goes into that market. And there are other countries that supply as well. So the supply has got to be coordinated to some extent. There's good information, so each country knows what they're going to send into that market. And the importers and the marketers on that side can plan accordingly. So we're part of a bigger picture, not just South Africa. We've got to work together with other countries to make sure that that market continues to grow. And on that, if I can just say that it might sound strange, but Peru is our major competition, but we're also members of an organization called the World Avocado Organization. And South Africa and Peru are the major supporters of that. And what we do through that organization is we fund generic promotion of avocados in the European market. And the philosophy behind it is although we're competing, we've got to make sure that that market grows. In other words, we've got to grow the size of the pie so that everybody can still get a slice. And that's how the philosophy has been for many years, and that's why we still, I think, having growth which is sustainable in that market.
So I think the big question would be, what is the ultimate growing conditions? Because our season seems a little bit longer than the Peruvian one. What can we do, or can we start utilizing other provinces with different rainfall schedules to actually produce for a longer time during the year?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So in South Africa, our traditional season up in Limpopo and Mpumalanga, which were the traditional production regions, ran from about February, March, all the way through to September, and then it really stopped. If you look at what's happening now, we've got cultivars that can then be harvested later. That's one of the things. But also, the further south that you move, the later you can harvest your avocados. So we are seeing quite a lot of expansion in KwaZulu-Natal, particularly in the cooler regions, and then also down in a bit in the Eastern Cape and in the Western Cape, particularly around the Georgia area, where they harvest much later. So up in the north here, we're ending our harvesting in September, and they're only starting at that time, and they harvest all the way through to December. So that's an advantage both for local supply, because there's lower volume at that time currently, but also the export market, because you go out of the markets after Peru, so you're harvesting late. And then up in the northern regions, in areas that were traditionally very hot and considered marginal for avocado production, they're not ideal, because you do ideally require a high rainfall, cool climate. But in the hot areas, if you've got the right the irrigation, the right cultivars, and the right management, you can actually come in early and be harvesting in early to mid-February. And that's what's also happening. So growers are looking for opportunities to supply early and late. I think that's where the future is. But that said, that market will also get full. So anybody growing in those regions still has to make sure that they're competitive.
Well, Derek, we're going to be back with you in a second. It's Derek Donkin, hy's van Fruit South Africa en die SA Avokado-Growers Association. Ons gesels 'n bietjie oor avokados. Nou eers tyd vir die Grootplaas kalender. Welkom terug hier op Grootplaas. Ons gas vanoggend is Derek Donkin, hy's van Fruit South Africa en die South African Avokado-Growers Association. Ons gepraat 'n bietjie oor avocados. Now, Derek, with local demand growing rapidly, how are we balancing exports between obviously a consumer appetite in overseas and also a local appetite?
So most growers actually don't grow just for the export or the local markets. They produce their crop in such a way that they can export. So for many growers in the main production regions, export is the focus. However, you don't have 100% export quality. So when there's export packed, there's also volume going into the local market. And that way, we keep up the supply to the local market. People might ask the question, well, do we only get the second grade here, the second best in South Africa? That's often the question that's asked. And yes, there might be a few more external blemishes on the fruit, but on the inside, it's exactly the same and just as good as what goes for export. In the export market, they're very focused on what the fruit looks like cosmetically. And it also depends where you buy it. Some retailers would like a very shiny, perfect, blemish-free fruit, and you will get that, and obviously you pay a higher price for that. but there's everything. Other retailers will accept a slightly lower external standard, but still good internal quality. And then you have the informal trade as well, which people buy from, which is supplied into and has a slightly lower grade, but all good quality fruit. And then in the early season and the late season, there are some growers at the moment that specifically produce for the local market. So I think it's about a balance of supply and demand, and the demand is growing in this country. Growers obviously are business people, and they look for where they can get the best price and what the market can pay. But because you have a variety of grades in what you produce, there's always enough for the local market as well. And if you look at the supply into the export market in the peak times there, that's when you have the peak supply into the local market. So export and local do go hand in hand.
Derek, can you maybe explain to us what the grading process on the fruit is?
So, yeah, when the fruit is picked, generally in the orchards, something that's severely damaged by insects or some sort of mechanical damage doesn't even go to the pack house. When the fruit gets to the pack house, it goes onto the pack line, and there it's sorted in the beginning, either by hand or in the more modern pack houses. They have electronic sorters which take photos of the fruit and sort out what we'd call factory grade, which goes to processing, either guacamole or oil. And that would be fruit that's either quite small or has severe external blemishes. And then it goes onto a pack line and it's graded between local and export market. And that's really on the external appearance of the fruit and also the fruit size. So very often the export market wants larger sizes. There is some smaller fruit which goes into that market, but obviously the price is lower. And depending on the demand in the market, the pack house adjusts what they send to local and export, and also the various sizes, what we call counts, the number of fruit that you can fit into a carton will go into the export or the local market. And there are supermarket programs locally which people have to supply, either the pack house or the marketing companies involved, or both. And they've got certain quotas to meet that they have to supply on a weekly basis. And all of those things influence the decision as to what goes into export and what goes into local market.
So as with any other industry in South Africa, there's obviously some challenges when it comes to farming the avos. With climate change and water scarcity being some of the biggest issues the farmers are struggling with, how is the avocado industry adapting and making sure it's resilient to these factors?
So with climate change, obviously, with everyone, the weather events are getting more extreme. If it's frost, it's colder. If it's hail, it's heavier. If it's hot, it's hotter. So those are things that are difficult to control. But I think one of the big things, obviously, is the use of water. We know that our population is growing, so there's demand for human consumption of water, but agriculture must also continue to produce food for the growers. And I think what's happening is that people are very aware that water is a scarce resource. So the growers are aware of that. They only have a limited quota of water that they can use. And it makes sense because they want to expand to use that water more effectively. So what we're seeing more and more, particularly with expansion or replanting of orchards, is that high-tech irrigation systems like low-flow drip are being used. And this allows growers not only to use less water, but actually to use the water in such a way that's going to give them a higher yield.
Yeah.
And they can do this because of the nature of the system, and they can irrigate a little bit for a long time each day over a large area. You can actually supply the tree the water that it needs, especially during the hot times of the day, and that allows the tree to photosynthesize more and then produce a higher yield. So there are wins in the pressure that's being put on us by the climate and by demands for water, that we can do things more efficiently. And fortunately, the technology is there to do it, and the industry is adapting with that technology and also using things like new rootstocks, which will result in a higher yield. Derek,
I'm going to have to, unfortunately, cut you off there. Our time is running out. But thank you so much for your time this morning. Derek Donkin van Fruit South Africa en die SA Avokado Growers Association. Dis dit vir Grootplaas vanoggend. Ons hoop jy het lekker saam met ons gekeer en ons sien jou weer môre.